At 42, Rhasha looked like a woman who had done everything right. She taught Sunday school, wore modest dresses, and spoke with the calm assurance of someone who had made peace with life's limitations. But behind that composure lived a secret that pulsed quietly through her nights, a secret that no prayer had silenced. She had never known a man's touch, yet her mind was crowded with visions that frightened her as much as they thrilled her. Fantasies of surrender, of trust, of power exchanged rather than taken. Images that seemed too dark for a woman who still bowed her head before every meal. For years, she had convinced herself that holiness required silence, that her body was a vessel to be guarded, not explored. Yet, every time she closed her eyes, another world opened. A world where restraint met desire, where fear dissolved into safety. It wasn't sin she longed for, it was permission. No one around her would ever guess the storm she carried beneath her calm exterior. To them, she was disciplined, even saintly. To herself, she was divided, half light, half shadow, trapped between obedience and awakening. What she could not know was that the walls she had built to protect herself were about to tremble. Because soon, a stranger's voice, a therapist's question, and a single act of honesty would expose the part of her that had been waiting patiently to feel alive for the first time. Rhasha's life had always been made of discipline and quiet repetition. Mornings began before dawn with a prayer whispered into the soft hum of her Detroit apartment. She worked as an administrative assistant at a small law firm where she was known for her precision and politeness. Her desk was always organized, her clothes pressed, her smile courteous but distant. Nothing about her life invited curiosity, and that was exactly how she wanted it. To the outside world, she was composed, dependable, unshakably moral. Inside, however, a question had begun to grow, one she could no longer dismiss with scripture or self-control. Her marriage had ended 6 years earlier, quietly and without scandal. Her husband, a gentleman raised in the same church community, had shared her conviction that sex was something sacred, something to be saved. But saving had become a way of never touching, never exploring, never feeling. The wedding night was spent in prayer rather than passion, followed by months of awkward attempts and silent shame. They divorced with no anger, only confusion. He moved away. She stayed, buried in her routines. Yet, even after years of solitude, Rhasha could not erase the echo of that emptiness. By her 40s, she had learned to live without desire. She took care of her aging mother, attended every church event, volunteered at food drives, and kept her world small. But at night, when the noise of the city faded, something deeper spoke to her. It wasn't lust. It was a hunger to be known, to surrender without fear. She didn't understand where it came from or why it frightened her so much. The first crack appeared one afternoon when she stumbled upon a podcast about emotional intimacy. The host, a soft-spoken woman with a calm, healing voice, talked about how repression could disguise itself as virtue. Rhasha listened with a knot in her chest. The woman's words were gentle but direct. Many of us were taught to protect our bodies so fiercely that we forgot to live inside them. That sentence followed her for weeks. It showed up in her dreams, in her journal, in her prayers. She began to notice how disconnected she felt from her own body, the stiffness in her shoulders, the way she breathed shallowly when someone looked her in the eyes. One evening, after finishing her chores, she sat on her bed and whispered, "What if I've been protecting myself from life?" The thought terrified her, but it also felt like the beginning of something true. She started reading quietly. Articles, essays, even spiritual reflections that spoke about embodiment and consent and awareness. It wasn't rebellion. It was curiosity. She wanted to understand what it meant to belong to herself, not to a rule. It was through one of these readings that she discovered a small therapeutic circle for women dealing with intimacy shame. The sessions focused not on sex, but on trust, voice, and presence. Rhasha hesitated for weeks before signing up. She feared being recognized, judged, or misunderstood. When she finally walked into that room for the first time, surrounded by women her age and older, she realized how many shared the same silence. That evening, as she listened to their stories of marriages without touch, of faith confused with guilt, of love mixed with fear, she felt her throat tighten. For the first time in her adult life, she wasn't alone in her confusion. The ache that had once felt private began to sound like a collective prayer for freedom. Something within her shifted that day. It wasn't liberation yet, only awareness. But for a woman who had spent 4 decades locked inside propriety, even awareness felt like rebellion. She left the session in silence, clutching a small notebook the therapist had given each participant. On the cover were 3 words that she cannot stop reading. Start where you are. For weeks after that first meeting, Rhasha carried the notebook everywhere, tucked inside her purse, between work files, even on her bedside table. But she couldn't bring herself to write in it. The blank pages seemed to accuse her, asking questions she wasn't yet brave enough to answer. What did she truly want? What did she fear? What did she believe about her own body? The silence inside her felt heavier now that she had heard other women speak their truths aloud. One evening, while folding laundry, her hand brushed over the soft fabric of a silk scarf she had bought years ago, but never worn. The sensation startled her, a whisper of pleasure so small it felt forbidden. She froze, the scarf in her hand, realizing she couldn't remember the last time she had touched something simply because it felt good. Her life had been about endurance, not enjoyment. It was as if she had built an entire identity around staying untouched by people, by desire, by life itself. At her next therapy session, she finally spoke. Her voice trembled at first, then steadied. She admitted that she had never experienced physical intimacy, not even with her husband, and that she often felt both proud and ashamed of that fact. The therapist, a woman named Althea, listened quietly before saying, "Sometimes purity isn't about what we keep out, it's about what we're afraid to let in." The words sank into Rhasha like water into dry earth. That night, she wrote her first journal entry, "I am afraid of being seen." But maybe that's where freedom begins. It was short, hesitant, but real. Each day after, she added a few lines, small observations about her body, her breath, her thoughts. She began to notice the way her shoulders lifted in tension whenever someone mentioned love or touch. She began to see how her faith had been built on fear more than connection. Weeks turned into months. Rochelle attended every group session, still quiet, but no longer invisible. When other women spoke of their longing or shame, she nodded, recognizing herself in their words. One woman, nearly 60, described the first time she allowed herself to dance alone in her kitchen without guilt. The story was simple, yet Rhasha felt tears rise. That night, she tried the same. Music low, lights dim, movements uncertain. Her body felt foreign, like a language she'd forgotten how to speak. But when she caught her reflection in the window, awkward, shy, alive, something within her softened. She began reading late into the night, poems, memoirs, even gentle erotic literature written by women reclaiming their desire. She didn't consume them in secret shame. She studied them, searching for herself between the lines. What struck her wasn't the sensual imagery, but the tenderness. The way these writers spoke of trust, surrender, and self-knowledge. For the first time, she saw desire not as rebellion, but as awareness. Still, the contradictions tormented her. During the day, she recited verses about patience and restraint. At night, her imagination painted vivid scenes of control and release. It wasn't the act itself she craved, it was the emotional honesty, the exchange of power born from trust. She feared she was crossing some invisible line, yet she couldn't stop her mind from wandering there. One evening, she confessed this tension to Althea. "It's like two voices inside me," she said. "One says, I must stay pure. The other says purity is just another kind of prison." Althea nodded, her tone calm. "Then maybe your work isn't to silence either voice," she said, "but to let them finally speak to each other." That night, Rhasha dreamed of standing in a room filled with locked doors. She held a single key, trembling, uncertain which one it belonged to. When she woke, she realized the truth she had been avoiding. Every door was hers. Rhasha began to test the edges of her life, the way a swimmer tests cold water, one toe at a time. She set gentle alarms on her phone that read "breathe," and when they rang, she paused wherever she was and inhaled until her ribs moved. At first, it felt theatrical, like pretending to be someone who understood her own body. Then, one morning on the bus, the breath actually landed. The city noise softened, her shoulders lowered, and she felt a brief warmth behind her sternum, as if a locked window had opened a crack. Her experiments stayed small. She switched from fluorescent kitchen lights to a single table lamp at night. She bought unscented lotion and took 5 unhurried minutes to rub it into her hands, palms to knuckles, as if returning them to herself. She placed the silk scarf on the back of a chair so she would have to touch it when she sat down. Each act was almost invisible from the outside, yet it bent the axis of her days. At the women's circle, Althea introduced a practice called body mapping. They named where grief lived, where anger hid, where hope appeared. When it was her turn, Rhasha touched 2 places, her throat and the space low in her belly. "Here," she said softly, "is where words stop. And here is where they wait." No one laughed. No one rushed to fix her. The group simply nodded as if they recognized the cartography. Embarrassed by how much that tenderness moved her, she went looking for structure. She read about consent frameworks, traffic light models, check-ins, aftercare. These words had once seemed like codes from a foreign language. Now they sounded like architecture: beams, doors, safe exits. She realized her fantasies had never been about danger. They were about the relief of not being the one who held everything together. They were about letting trust hold the weight for once. On quiet nights, she drafted short scenes in her journal. 2 characters negotiating boundaries, naming triggers, agreeing on the signal to pause. She kept them PG, focused on voice and rules rather than acts. When anxiety rose, she stopped and prayed, not for the desire to vanish, but for the courage to stay honest. Then came the invitation. Althea announced a weekend workshop on somatic consent: breathing, grounding, asking, receiving, declining. No sexual content, strictly educational, facilitated by 2 practitioners with trauma-informed training. Old reflexes surged: shame, caution, a wish to disappear. But another part of her, newly awake, whispered yes. She signed up under her middle name and told no one. The workshop met in a bright studio above a bakery. The room smelled faintly of sugar and coffee. Mats lined the floor, chairs circled the walls, and the table held tea and tissues. The facilitators began with agreements: confidentiality, opt-in only, leave any exercise at any time. The words lowered something tight in her chest. When they offered a practice called consensual touch with objects, Rhasha exhaled. Participants chose a scarf, a stone, or a soft brush and explored sensation on their own arms, noticing pace, pressure, and breath. She was surprised by how much agency lived in tiny choices: slower, lighter, stop. During a paired exercise, each person practiced saying yes, no, and maybe to simple requests like, "May I sit closer?" or "Would you like more space?" The first time someone asked to sit beside her, every muscle braced. She heard her own voice, thin but steady. "No, thank you." The room did not collapse. The other person nodded, moved away, and smiled. Relief flooded her. Later, she tried yes for 2 minutes, and when the timer chimed, she surprised herself by saying, "That's enough for now." The facilitator called it integrity. She called it breathing. That night, she lay awake in her hotel room, listening to the city hum through the window unit. She wasn't aroused, she was alive. The difference mattered. Her imagination offered its familiar scenes, but now the scenes wore seatbelts and handrails. They had checklists and safe words, not as props, but as proof that someone would stop if she whispered stop. She cried quietly into the hotel towel, not from shame, but from the ache of realizing how long she had wanted this, an end to vigilance. After the workshop, life did not flip a switch. The escalator moved by inches. She practiced naming sensations while washing dishes: warm water, slippery plates, shoulders softening. She practiced requests with friends. "Could we meet at a quieter cafe?" She practiced boundaries at work. "I can help with that tomorrow." Small victories accumulated like coins in a jar. One evening, scrolling through a forum about consent education, she saw a post from a man named Evan. He was 35, a former youth counselor turned grad student in social work. His comment was careful, thoughtful, free of performance. He wrote about learning to unlearn, how he had mistaken silence for agreement, how he was practicing curiosity instead of pursuit. She read the paragraph 3 times, surprised by the calm it brought to her chest. He wasn't flashy. He sounded like someone who checked the locks before leaving, someone who would ask before reaching for the light. At the next circle, Althea noticed a change and asked, "What's different?" Rhasha answered without flinching. "I'm letting the two voices speak to each other," she said. "The one that wants safety and the one that wants surrender. They are negotiating." The group laughed softly, not at her, but with relief, the sound people make when a knot gives. On the way home, twilight pooled in the streets like ink. She walked slower than usual, feeling her feet inside her shoes, the air on her neck, the steady rhythm of her breath. The city looked the same. She did not. The escalation had not been a race toward heat. It had been a long walk toward permission. And permission, she was learning, could be the most powerful form of control she had ever known. She kept breathing. The morning she met Evan in person, it didn't feel like a movie moment. There were no sparks, no music, just two people sitting at a small table in a quiet cafe, both a little nervous, both trying to appear composed. He had kind eyes and a calm presence that made silence feel safe instead of awkward. They talked about ordinary things at first, work, music, travel, but there was something beneath the surface, an invisible current of understanding between two people who had both learned how to move slowly. Rhasha found herself listening more than speaking. When he talked about his work with trauma survivors, she noticed how carefully he chose his words, how he paused before giving advice, how he made space for quiet moments. For years, she had equated power with dominance. Now, she was learning that real power could sound like patience. As the weeks passed, their friendship deepened into a quiet rhythm. They exchanged messages about articles, podcasts, and ideas, rarely crossing the line into anything suggestive. Yet, every conversation left her with a soft warmth in her chest, a sense of safety she had never known. It wasn't attraction that frightened her. It was the realization that she trusted him. And for a woman who had spent a lifetime guarding her inner world, that trust felt like the most intimate act of all. One evening, they met at a bookstore that hosted open readings. She had mentioned that she'd been writing small pieces inspired by her journal exercises, and he encouraged her to read one. Trembling, she stood before a small audience and read a short reflection about control and surrender, not in the language of sex, but in the language of breath. The piece ended with a line that came to her as she read it aloud. Maybe the safest place to fall is into someone who knows how to catch themselves. When she looked up, Evan was watching her, not with hunger, but with reverence. Later, over coffee, he said quietly, "You have a voice that heals." She laughed nervously. "I've spent most of my life silencing it." His reply was simple, "Then maybe it's time to stop whispering." That night, she couldn't sleep. The words circled in her head until she opened her notebook and began to write without restraint. Not fantasy, not fear, just honesty. She wrote about her loneliness, her confusion, her body's forgotten language. She wrote until the sun began to rise, and when she stopped, she felt emptied and full at the same time. She realized that her longing wasn't about another person touching her. It was about her own readiness to be touched by life. The next time she saw Evan, he asked if she wanted to join a consent-based embodiment workshop he was helping to organize. It wasn't romantic, it was collaborative. She hesitated, but said yes. During one of the sessions, participants were invited to explore the idea of holding, not physically, but emotionally. Evan volunteered to partner with her. They sat back to back, eyes closed, breathing in sync. She could feel his presence behind her, solid but unobtrusive, like a wall that could support but never confine. At one point, the facilitator asked, "What do you notice?" Rhasha whispered, "I'm not bracing anymore." Evan said softly, "That's what trust feels like." Tears welled up, quiet and unforced. It wasn't about attraction, it was about arrival. Something long frozen inside her finally exhaled. She had thought awakening would feel like fire. Instead, it felt like water. Gentle, persistent, cleansing. When the session ended, they didn't rush to speak. They just sat in silence, backs still touching, both breathing evenly. The room around them faded, replaced by a sense of calm so pure it scared her. For the first time in 42 years, her body was no longer a battlefield. It was a home. Later that evening, alone in her apartment, she wrote a single line at the top of a fresh page. "Today, I didn't need to be saved. I just needed to be seen." The transformation had begun. It wasn't the discovery of pleasure yet. It was the discovery of peace. And peace, she realized, was the foundation of every kind of love that mattered. In the weeks that followed, the quiet between them became something sacred. They no longer needed long conversations to feel connected. A shared glance, a gentle nod, a message that simply read, "Thinking of you," each carried more weight than a dozen declarations. Rhasha noticed how her nervous system began to mirror this new rhythm. She no longer woke with the tightness in her chest that had once been constant. Her mornings were slower now. She brewed her coffee without rushing, opened the curtains, and let the light fall over her hands before beginning her day. Her journal, once a place of confession, became a record of gratitude. The entries changed from "I'm afraid" to "I'm listening." She wrote about the moments she felt her breath deepening, the small surprises that made her smile, a child laughing on the bus, the scent of rain on concrete, the way her body now felt inhabited instead of absent. She realized that healing wasn't a destination, but a relationship with herself that needed to be tended daily. When she saw Evan again, their connection continued to evolve in its own measured way. They talked openly about boundaries, expectations, and what safety meant for both of them. There was never pressure, only choice. One evening, as they left a cafe, he reached for her hand. The gesture was small, but the meaning enormous. She didn't flinch. Instead, she let her fingers rest in his, aware of every heartbeat echoing through her palm. That night, she wrote, "I thought surrender meant giving up control. But maybe it means trusting that I won't be hurt when I let go." Her days began to expand in color and sensation. She joined a gentle movement class, learning how to feel her muscles stretch without judgment. She visited her mother more often, finding that their conversations were softer now, less about duty, more about presence. Even her prayers shifted tone. She no longer asked to be purified of desire. She asked to meet it with honesty and care. The women in her circle noticed the change before she did.
"You look lighter," one said.
Another added, "You sound like you're finally breathing."
Rhasha smiled because both were true. The old self that had survived through control wasn't gone, but it had learned to share space with something new: acceptance. She had discovered that wholeness wasn't the absence of tension. It was the capacity to hold tension without collapsing. Her therapist, Althea, invited her to close their sessions with a ritual of acknowledgement. At the final meeting, they sat facing each other in silence for a full minute. Then, Althea said, "You've done something most people never manage. You've turned curiosity into compassion." Rhasha felt tears rise, not from sadness, but from recognition. She had spent years trying to fix what she thought was broken, only to discover there was nothing broken to begin with, only unheard parts of herself waiting to be named. That evening, she walked home slowly through the cooling air, the city lights flickering like small blessings. When she entered her apartment, she placed her notebook on the table and opened a blank page. This time, she didn't hesitate. Her words flowed freely, steady and clear. I am not a contradiction. I am the meeting point of what I was told to fear and what I have learned to love. I am allowed to want. I am allowed to wait. I am allowed to feel everything that lives between those two truths. She closed the journal and rested her hands over it, sensing a quiet pulse beneath her palms, the same pulse that had once terrified her. Now it felt like prayer, steady and real. The transformation was not loud or sudden. It was the gentle certainty that she had at last come home to herself. In the months that followed, Rhasha began to see her past not as wasted years, but as preparation. Every silence, every boundary drawn too tightly, every unanswered question had been part of the long education of her heart. What she once called failure now felt like the soil that had allowed something tender to grow. She no longer winced when she thought of her first marriage. Instead, she understood it as two souls doing their best with the tools they had been given. He had not been her jailer, and she had not been his punishment. They had simply been two people afraid of their own humanity. Her reflections grew quieter, less analytical, and more embodied. While walking to work, she noticed how sunlight touched her skin differently, as if it recognized her. She started keeping a small list in her notebook titled "Moments When I Am Here." It included simple things: warm tea on a cold morning, laughter during laundry, music spilling from a passing car. These fragments were proof that presence didn't need an audience. When friends asked why she seemed changed, she didn't mention Evan or therapy or workshops. She said, "I learned how to stay." They usually smiled, not fully understanding, but the phrase held everything she couldn't explain. Staying had become her practice, the ability to remain within herself when discomfort rose, when memories resurfaced, when desire stirred. She realized that healing wasn't about removing the ache. It was about trusting it to guide her deeper. At 43, she celebrated her birthday differently. Instead of a gathering, she took a train to the coast and spent a weekend alone by the water. She watched the tide move in and out, mirroring her own rhythm of contraction and release. On the second morning, she stood barefoot on the sand and whispered a prayer she hadn't known she needed. "Thank you for letting me arrive late, but arrive whole." Back home, she began mentoring younger women in her church who struggled with similar questions.
She didn't preach, she listened.
When one woman tearfully confessed that she felt broken because she didn't crave intimacy like others, Rhasha smiled gently and said, "Maybe your body isn't so.
Maybe the world is just too loud."
That sentence would later spread quietly among the group, passed like a small torch of relief. Her connection with Evan continued, steady and unhurried. They still hadn't crossed any physical threshold beyond what felt mutual and calm, yet their bond deepened. Sometimes they sat in silence for hours, reading in the same room, comfortable with the absence of performance.
It was the kind of closeness that didn't need proof.
For Rhasha, that was enough.
She thought often about the word purity, once her prison and now her paradox. She realized that real purity was not about what one avoided, but about the honesty with which one lived. It meant meeting each moment without pretending, allowing contradictions to coexist without shame. In that sense, she was purer now than she had ever been. Looking back, she understood that awakening hadn't come through rebellion or revelation, but through attention, the quiet act of noticing what had always been there. It was never about being touched by another, but about touching her own life fully, with respect and curiosity. As she closed her journal one evening, she smiled at the thought that she was no longer seeking to be transformed. She was simply learning how to remain human, in the most forgiving sense of the word. One evening, months later, Rhasha returned to the same cafe where she had first met Evan.
The air smelled of roasted beans and rain on pavement.
She sat by the window, her notebook open to a fresh page. For a long time, she didn't write. She simply watched people passing by. Young couples, older friends, strangers in quiet conversation. Each carried their own private worlds, their own fears and unfinished longings. She felt connected to all of them, as if life itself were whispering that no one is ever truly behind.
When Evan arrived, they didn't rush into talk.
He placed a small wrapped gift on the table, a leather-bound journal embossed with the words, "Continue." She traced the letters with her fingertips, smiling. "You think I finished something?" she asked. He shook his head. I think you've begun." That night, back in her apartment, she opened the new journal and began to write, not about shame or absence, but about the quiet fullness she now carried. Her words flowed easily, steady and unhurried. "I used to think awakening would come like a storm, but it came like a slow tide, erasing old footprints, leaving room for new ones. I am not the woman I was when I began this journey. I no longer confuse obedience with peace or silence with virtue. My body is not a battlefield. It's a witness. And every part of me, even the ones I once hid, belongs." She paused, listening to the hum of the city outside, the faint rhythm of traffic fading into the night. Then she wrote one final question to herself. What if desire was never meant to be conquered, only understood? Closing the notebook, she felt no need to answer. The question itself was enough, a compass pointing inward. She looked around her apartment.
at the scarf still hanging on the chair, at the old notebook filled with pages of struggle and grace.
Every object told a story of becoming. She brewed a cup of tea, opened the window, and let the night air in. Somewhere far below, someone was laughing. Somewhere else, a song was playing. For the first time, she didn't feel like an observer of life, but part of its pulse. Before turning off the light, she whispered a small promise to herself. No more shrinking. No more waiting for permission. From now on, I live open.
And if someone were to ask what changed her, she would not speak of workshops or therapy or a man's kindness.
She would say only this. One day, I stopped running from my own heartbeat, and it turned out to be music.
To anyone listening, her story would not sound miraculous.
There were no sudden revelations, no grand rescues, just the steady work of learning how to feel again. Yet that was the miracle, that after 40 years of silence, a woman could find her way back to herself simply by saying yes to her own life.
So if you've ever felt too late, too guarded, or too afraid to begin, remember her story.
Healing does not demand youth or perfection, only willingness. Because somewhere within you, as within her, a quiet flame still burns, waiting not for permission, but for